Welcome in, everyone. Happy Halloween. It's Thursday morning. I'm Josh Larky. This is the Dominator. I've got some starts and sits for the good people today. Do not ask me what my costume is. It's obvious. I am a middle-aged dad on vacation. I am every middle-aged dad on vacation. This is what they end up looking like. Their wife dresses them up, and they end up quite like this. Compliments are appreciated. I will not take feedback at this time, but I will take Patrick Mahomes as a nice start this week. He's the Fantasy Pros consensus quarterback 8. He faces the Buccaneers. When adjusting for opponents faced, Tampa Bay's allowing 2 more fantasy points to quarterbacks than expected. The Chiefs' implied team total is 27 points. That's nearly 4 touchdowns. There's going to be a lot of scoring in this one. Last week, DeAndre Hopkins only ran 14 routes to Travis Kelce's 36. So to 14, 36, we're very, very different. But I think Hopkins will be more acclimated this week. And then Xavier Worthy, we'll talk about him more later in the show, but he's really starting to come into his own. And I think he and Mahomes can really connect on a deep pass this week. Well, we'll talk about Worthy more in a little bit. I think Patrick Mahomes, strong start this week. Stream. We're going right back to him. He gave us 20, almost 30 fantasy points last week. I think it was like 29.8. Stream Bo Nix, the consensus quarterback 15 this week at the Ravens. Told you to stream him last week. I'm going to tell you to do it again. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. And the opponent's great. It's the Ravens. You adjust for opponent's face. They are the second best matchup for fantasy quarterbacks. Ravens are a pass funnel defense. They stop the run, but they can't stop the pass. Nix has at least 21 fantasy points in 3 of his past 4 games. Yeah, like I mentioned, he had the near 30 burger last week against the Panthers. He ran for at least 60 yards in week 6 and week 7. Then he throws for 284 yards and 3 touchdowns in week 8. We are looking at a true dual threat fantasy quarterback in Bo Nix. Running backs. We are going to start Tony Pollard, the Fantasy Pros consensus running back 17 this week versus the Patriots. So the Patriots have struggled versus running backs this year for fantasy purposes. Tony Pollard had 23 receiving yards last week. That was his second best mark on the year for him with no DeAndre Hopkins. I think that makes sense. You lose a key receiver, and then more targets simply have to go to the running backs when the receivers don't get open. I think Pollard continues to get decent target volume, even with Tajay Spears likely returning. And I mean, if we just look at Pollard, I mean, he's played with Spears about half the games this year. Pollard still has at least 18 touches in all but 1 game this year. We're also going to start Chase Brown, the consensus running back 22 versus the Las Vegas Raiders. Now, the Bengals are tied for the 3rd highest implied team total of the week, same as the Chiefs. It's 27. Hefty. Chase Brown had a season high 4 targets last week because T. Higgins missed the game. I think T. Higgins misses week 9 as well. There's lots of touchdown upside in this one for Chase Brown with that high team total. And then the Raiders are the 3rd best matchup for opposing running backs when adjusting for opponents faced. When you adjust for that, running backs are scoring 5.5 more fantasy points than expected. Nice. And we're going to start. Got one more running back start for you. Alexander Mattison, Fantasy Pros consensus running back 26 at the Bengals. We're sticking with that game. So we were sitting Mattison most likely last week against the Chiefs. Brutal matchup for fantasy running backs. But this week he gets the Bengals. It's a slightly above average matchup for running backs in fantasy. Mattison has at least 17 touches in 4 straight games. Wild. Mattison, the sneakiest bell cow. I think he's playable. He's a fantasy RB2 this week. Now, before we hit receivers, I'll be going over all my sits as well after this for the week. And I've got my underdog fantasy picks. We're hitting around 2/3 of our picks this year. We were a Javonte Williams touchdown away from 10xing our money. We're back this week. This is the week. We'll get to those underdog picks shortly. Wide receiver. Start Josh Downs. Duh, right? Huh? Yeah, we're all starting Josh Downs. He's the consensus wide receiver 19 this week at the Vikings. Anthony Richardson's been benched. Joe Flacco's back in at quarterback. Joe Flacco's throwing at least 10 more pass attempts a game than Anthony Richardson, so there's more pass volume. And then get this. This is one of the best stats of the week. In 3 games this year with Joe Flacco, here's what Josh Downs is averaging. 10 targets, 8 catches, 72 yards. He scored in 2 of those 3 games. 19.5 fantasy points per game. That's the same as Justin Jefferson this year. That'd be the wide receiver 5. Josh Downs, start him at the Vikings. It's also just a good matchup. I mean, what more do you need for fantasy football than Josh Downs? You also might need or want, I want, Chris Olave. Consensus wide receiver 20 at the Panthers. 3/4 of his routes were out wide last week, and he's facing the Panthers. The Panthers have just been a factory for outside wide receivers and fantasy points this year. Chris Olave had over 100 yards last week, and it looks like there's a good chance he gets Derek Carr back for week 9. Start Lad McConkey. Fantasy Pros consensus wide receiver 27 at the Browns. Now, Cleveland's been solid on the outside, but they're a top 12 matchup for slot receivers this year in fantasy. That's why we break it down. I post my slot and out wide matchups on my Twitter at JLarkyTweets. I will be posting some other matchups as well because I mentioned some of the adjusted fantasy points where I look at the opponents faced and I adjust quarterbacks, running backs, slot and outside receivers, and then tight ends. I might just post it all for you this week at JLarkyTweets on Twitter. Anyway, McConkey, he's got a top 12 slot matchup at the Browns. McConkey's got at least 7 targets in 3 straight games. Last week, he officially broke out for fantasy. After at least 7 targets in 3 straight games, he drops to 6 targets, but he catches all 6 for 111 yards and 2 touchdowns. This whole Chargers passing attack is trending up. Start Jakobi Meyers. Fantasy Pros consensus wide receiver 29 at the Bengals. First off, it's a plus matchup. Second off, Myers is averaging 6 receptions per game over his past 4 games. He's been targeted at least 9 times in 3 of his past 4 games. The Raiders are more than touchdown underdogs. I think the Raiders are going to throw a decent amount in this game. And then we are going to start Xavier Worthy. He showed up in my sit column a couple times early in the season and he was struggling. He's still the wide receiver 30. He's basically just every week, the Fantasy Pros rankers turn their minds off and just put him at wide receiver 30. Well, folks, it's time to start him. They got it right. It's time to start him. Xavier Worthy, wide receiver 30 by consensus versus the Buccaneers. So Tampa is a really plus matchup to start with for receivers this year. I mentioned with Mahomes earlier, I talked about Worthy. So Worthy now has 8 targets in back-to-back games, but he only has 56 receiving yards on those 16 targets. That's 3.5 yards per target. He's due for significant regression. I'd expect him to be at 8, 9, 10 yards per target. And in these past 2 games, so I guess we'll think about it like this. He's a rookie receiver. He plays 5 games. Then they have the week 6 bye. Then rookies, as I always mention on this show, they start to get more acclimated after the bye. Sure enough, weeks 7 and 8, after the bye, Worthy has now been targeted on 30% of his routes run. So nearly 1 in 3 routes that he's running on the field, roughly 1 in 3 routes that he runs, Patrick Mahomes throws him a pass. That's a borderline top 12 fantasy receiver caliber number. He plays with Patrick Mahomes. He faces the Buccaneers. It's a great matchup. This, producers, listen, producers, earth to producers. I want this as a soundbite. Xavier Worthy, week 9. This is his breakout game for fantasy football. At tight end, we are going to start, once again, told you to start him last week. I'll say this. We'll take the W and the L. I told you to start Cade Otton because he'd get peppered with targets. Ding, ding. Correct. And then I was like, we should probably sit Baker Mayfield. He has no receivers. Boo. Turns out Baker Mayfield, even though he had 82 passing yards to his total to his top 3 starting receivers, he still lit it up in fantasy. I didn't realize just how good Cade Otton and the running backs would be in the passing game. Whoops. Anyway, we got 1 right, 1 wrong. We're going to start Cade Otton this week. He's a consensus tight end 6 at the Chiefs. I'm not, so obviously, like you think, well, duh, I'm going to start him. He's the tight end 6. Yeah, but because he was a waiver pickup, a lot of you out there with Otton are considering other options. Or you might have another option. You should start Cade Otton this week. I don't really care too much who your other options are. Cade Otton should be in the lineup. Otton caught 8 of 10 targets for 100 yards in week 7. 8 for 100 in week 7. The game Chris Godwin and Mike Evans got hurt. Then last week 8, he caught 9 of 10 targets. So 10 targets again, caught 9 of 10 for 81 yards and 2 touchdowns. And now he faces the Chiefs. The Chiefs are the best possible matchup for opposing fantasy tight ends. They're allowing more than 5 fantasy points per game above expectation to tight ends. Even when you adjust for opponents, it's awesome. So if you have tight ends averaging 10 fantasy points a game, they'd be likely to score close to 15 fantasy points against the Chiefs. Cade Otton, truly elite start this week, again, in fantasy football. Now we've got Zach Ertz. You can stream him, the consensus tight end 14 at the Giants. He's averaging 4 catches and 43 yards per game. That's 8.3 PPR fantasy points on its own. He's catching stride with Jaden Daniels. The past 3 games, he's averaging 5 catches, 62 yards, and 13 fantasy points per game. And the last streamer, we could go with TJ Hockenson. Consensus tight end 17 versus the Colts. The Colts are a top 6 matchup for tight ends for fantasy football. TJ Hockenson, he practiced last week. He should be a pretty much full go for this week. I think you're going to get 4 to 6 catches, 40 to 60 yards, a decent chance for a touchdown. The Vikings have the 7th highest implied team total on the week, 26 points. That is hefty. We're gonna stream a little TJ Hockenson.
Hey, I know it's a popular statistic to cite, these underdog pick'ems, the vast majority of people go more than on any given player. Yeah, close to 80% of people, but that's because it's easier to find the shootouts than it is to find the dud games every Sunday afternoon. Like we knew week 5, Ravens-Bengals was going to be a shootout. And there goes Lamar Jackson for 4 touchdowns. There goes Joe Burrow for 5 touchdowns. Derrick Henry gets there. Zay Flowers is over 100 yards. Jamar Chase and T. Higgins both got there, as well as Chase Brown. Both Chases got there. You go more than, you 100x your payout on Underdog with their Pick 6 contest. But then you look at Dolphins Patriots, that's going down the toilet, right? Too bad Ramondre Stevenson at 18 fantasy points. But you improve your chances at positive returns when you correlate with these Underdog pick'ems. Use promo code Underworld. This is the biggest bonus Underdog has ever given out, up to $125. Promo code is Underworld. Put in $250, you get $125. Now go start picking.
Welcome back, everyone. I'm Josh Larky. This is the Dominator. We've got a question in the chat before we hit those fantasy sits. Lat McConkey or David Njoku as flex? Oh my God, that's a tough one. I lean McConkey. I usually, if I'm not sure who to pick, I go with the receiver because they generally have more yardage upside. So I'll go McConkey, but it's honestly close. I wouldn't fault you either way. And then they want to know Titans or Commanders defense. Titans get the Patriots. Commanders get the Giants. I would lean Commanders. They're playing pretty good football right now as a defense. Giants not playing very good football as an offense. Sits, quarterback. I am going to lean towards sitting the consensus quarterback 5 this week. Versus the Raiders, it's Joe Burrow. This is assuming, though, that T. Higgins sits. So I think Joe Burrow is kind of this low-end quarterback 1 for me this week. I think some of the Burrow managers might have better options. Like I think it's kind of a toss-up, Bo Nix or Joe Burrow. Ultimately, the Raiders are a good, not great matchup for quarterbacks. And if T. Higgins sits, then I'm just not very interested in Joe Burrow. If he plays, I think he's fine. I still wouldn't put him as the consensus quarterback 5. I don't actually know what's going on there. Like let's pump the brakes, people. But it's a good matchup. It's just if he's down as number 2 receiver, less interested. Sit, Bucky Irving, the consensus running back 27 at the Chiefs. The Chiefs are the toughest matchup for running backs. It's not even close. When you adjust for opponent, running back rooms against the Chiefs are scoring 10 fantasy points per game below what you think they're going to score. So if a running back room is averaging 20 fantasy points a game, you put them against the Chiefs, they're going to average 10. It's because the Chiefs have a really good run defense and teams are often in bad game scripts against them. Now, Bucky Irving had 7 receptions last week that bailed out his fantasy day, but it kind of hid. He still ran 30% fewer routes than Rachaad White. Rachaad White is still the primary pass catching back. If we zoom out, it looks like more of a Rachaad White game than a Bucky Irving game. This could get ugly. I mean, the Buccaneers are 9-point underdogs with the fourth lowest implied team total, 18.5 points. That's low touchdown upside for their main between the tackles runner and Bucky Irving. I'd rather start Rachaad White this week. And I'm also going to sit Javonte Williams, consensus running back 30 at the Ravens. The Ravens, as I mentioned before, it's an extreme pass funnel defense. They shut down running backs. Broncos have the second lowest implied team total, just 18 points for week 9. Minimal touchdown upside. One more running back, Rico Dowdle, the consensus running back 32 at the Falcons. Falcons allow 6 fantasy points below expectation of running backs this year after adjusting for who they're facing. That's bottom 3. Dowdle's gone over 12 touches in just one game this year because of bad game scripts. Dallas's defense has been ravaged by injuries. Bad matchup, game script concerns. Dowdle looks like more of a flex play. I don't think we need to start him this week. This is where it gets controversial. I had a hard time finding a fantasy sit this week because I knew who the logic and the data was pointing me to. I didn't know if I could pull the trigger. We pulled the trigger. Happy Halloween. It's spooky season, as the white girls say while they sip pumpkin spice. Spooky. I know it's scary. We're going to sit Zay Flowers. He's the consensus wide receiver 18 this week versus the Broncos. So let's break this down. I've got a lot of notes on Flowers because if we're telling you to sit this guy, you need a lot of information. So first off, Zay Flowers has been game script dependent. The Ravens have won 2 games by multiple scores. In those games, he's averaged 1.5 targets and 10 receiving yards per game. The Ravens throw when losing or in close games. Flowers basically this year has 4 big games and 4 duds. 2 of those 4 big games were losses. And then the other 2 were the wild 41-38 overtime game against the Bengals. And when he torched the Commanders earlier in the year before the Commanders defense came into its own. And that was a big back and forth game. Jaden Daniels, Lamar Jackson. Anyway, this week, the Ravens host the Broncos. They're favored by 10 points. The Ravens had the embarrassing loss to the Browns last week. And I think the Ravens steamrolled Denver this week. When you adjust for quality of opponent, Denver's the second worst fantasy matchup for slot receivers. And then on top of all of this, Deontay Johnson was just traded for. He's now a Raven. That should hurt Flowers' target share in some capacity. And at tight end, the sit might make sense now as well. It's Mark Andrews. So he's the tight end 11 by consensus this week. He faces the Broncos, obviously. So like Zay Flowers, I have pass volume concerns in this game environment where they're supposed to steamroll the Broncos and where it's hard to throw against the Broncos. Andrews has scored 4 touchdowns in the past 3 games, but he's averaged under 4.5 targets per game in that span. That's terrible. That's really bad. He's more of this fringe top 15, top 20 fantasy option this week. Definitely not a clear fantasy tight end 1 type. Now, before we get to the underdog pickups, we got one more question in the chat. Pick 2, Josh Downs, Zay Flowers, Lad McConkey. I am going to go Josh Downs, and we're going to lean Lad McConkey over Zay Flowers. Let's get controversial. So as I mentioned earlier in the show last week, I apologize. We were a Javonte Williams touchdown away from 10xing our money. The Broncos scored 4 touchdowns versus the Panthers. Unfortunately, Javonte Williams was not part of those 4 scores, but we're back this week. I've got 3 picks for you. So first, I mentioned start him earlier in the show. Patrick Mahomes, higher than 243.5 passing yards. So first off, he's 4-3 on this number for the season. That's good to start with. The Buccaneers are a great matchup for quarterbacks, as I mentioned. 5 of the 8 quarterbacks have thrown for at least 243 yards against them. The 3 who didn't were Jaden Daniels in his first NFL start. That was week 1. It's okay. Bo Nix hasn't really been a prolific passer until last week. And then Jalen Hurts, who's truly been up and down as a passer as well. All right, I think Patrick Mahomes gets there. DeAndre Hopkins more acclimated. Xavier Worthy coming into his own. And I will say, folks, when it comes out, I will probably take a higher on Xavier Worthy, either longest reception or receiving yards. It's just not out yet on Underdog. But when it comes out, if it's in the 40s or even the low 50s, I will be likely taking that. Longest receptions around 18 to 20 yards, I will be taking that. Lower on Zay Flowers. It's 55.5 total yards is the line. He's 4-4 on this number for the year. So it's a 50-50 line at first glance, but he's got the brutal matchup against Denver's secondary. Ravens are 10-point favorites. They might not need to throw much. And Deontay Johnson's in the mix for targets. I lean towards all the signs saying this is not really a Zay Flowers week. And then the last one, before I get you out of here, I'm Josh Larky. This is the Dominator. We're going to go higher on Halloween, higher on Jakobi Meyers, higher than 49.5 receiving yards. He has at least 49 receiving yards in 5 of 6 games this year. It's a good matchup against the Bengals. He's got at least 9 targets in 3 of his past 4 games since Davante Adams was quote unquote hurt and then traded. So we're going Patrick Mahomes higher passing yards, Myers higher receiving yards, Zay Flowers lower total yards. Last question in the chat, and I'll get you guys out of here. Pollard or Hunt this week? I would lean Kareem Hunt. Also Jaden Reed or Jalen Waddle. I think I'd lean Waddle there as of right now. I'm not sure if Jordan Love plays, but that could change. We have to monitor. We have to monitor. We have to monitor. I'm Josh Larky. This is the Dominator. This has been the Halloween edition. Spooky, scary. Actually, I'll leave you with this. I don't know if everyone out there knows this song. The producer's telling me to stop tangenting. We're already at over 20 minutes. Sorry. So last night, I'm headed to the gym with my girlfriend. And I'm like, do you have any Halloween songs? She says, no. She has a curse word in there for me, which I thought was offensive. She basically is like, I'm not a fucking loser. Why would I have a Halloween playlist? And then I put on a banger. And she realized she does have a Halloween song now. Everyone out there, I implore you to listen. It's a great song. It's called Spooky, Scary Skeletons. And for those fans of alliteration, Spooky, Scary Skeletons. It's a very good song. It's a very good song. I'll leave you with that. Happy Halloween. Check that song out. You will not be disappointed. It's for all the men out there with a lady in your life that you're trying to impress. If she doesn't have a Halloween playlist, put on Spooky, Scary Skeletons. Thank you, everyone.
Hey, I want to thank you for being part of this broadcast. If you have any thoughts on it, leave a comment. If you enjoyed it, make sure you leave a like. And if you want to see more shows on the Player Profiler channel, subscribe to it. That's how we know you want more.